Hey listeners, just a heads up that the second story we discuss in today's episode contains a description of someone taking their own life and references to suicide. It's the week ending Saturday the 4th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen devastating bushfires intensifying the Australian conversation around climate change, online banking systems crashing across the UK, and the passing of Monty Python's songwriter Neil Innes. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Arion McNicoll and Joe Evans, and from the week junior, Felicity Capon. Happy New Year, team.
Happy New Year.
And starting the show this week, it is Felicity. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week we remember that the pull of the past is irresistible.
Que l'honneur des Français consiste à continuer la guerre aux côtés de leurs alliés, et nous sommes résolus à le faire. Nous espérons qu'un jour, une force mécanique supérieure nous permettra d'avoir la victoire et de délivrer la patrie.
So for your topical clip of the week, you've chosen Charles de Gaulle from 1940 in the film To All Free Men.
I like to keep things current.
What's the story this week?
So this came from the Times newspaper, and it reports that President of France, Macron, wants to bestow France's highest honour, the Légion d'honneur, on London.
The city?
The city of London, yes, correct.
Okay.
And this would be to commemorate the city's role during the Second World War, when it provided a base for Charles de Gaulle, whose dulcet tones you were just listening to, who was the exiled French leader who came to London, fled to London to make his rallying call for his fellow countrymen to rise up and resist the Nazi invasion after France had capitulated in 1940.
Okay, so the highest honour that France can bestow, honouring our contribution to resolving the Second World War. What could possibly be controversial about that, Felicity?
Well, it was reported in Le Figaro, and some of the newspaper's readers in France are not all too happy about this. One of the quotes on the website was, this was giving an award to France's hereditary enemies, and Napoleon, who created the Légion d'honneur in 1802, would be turning in his grave. Obviously, it was an award that was created in between a succession of conflicts with Britain. The tabloids in the UK, no surprise to anyone, are sort of up in arms about this.
Well, hold on. When you say one quote in Le Figaro said, do you mean a commenter? Someone below the fold?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. So there have been people who are
a
commenting on
nutter
the story.
at home. Why are we taking this seriously?
Well, I think it struck me as a really interesting story about both looking back at the past and remembering our history. So this year, 18th of June, will mark de Gaulle's The Appeal of 18th of June's speech, where he made this speech. And I think there is a lot to be said for us forgetting our past and forgetting sort of the horrors of the Second World War and what actually went on. And then I suppose also looking forward to post-Brexit Europe, and is this France actually in some ways extending an olive branch and trying to maintain good relations, or possibly not. But I think it's interesting that pull of the past and sort of what it means for the future.
And Joe, the name Charles de Gaulle, I reckon to a lot of people of my generation and below, kind of means an airport, really. I'm aware of the French resistance, but actually I'd be hard pushed to really explain what Charles de Gaulle did in terms of his relationship with Britain in the Second World War. So there is a gap, isn't there, in the market for Britain and France to really be promoting that story?
There certainly is a gap, and when he arrived in the United Kingdom, a lot of members of the British cabinet ironically wanted nothing to do with him. He ended up sort of using London as a platform for his sort of guerrilla warfare activities, but also to publish sort of newspapers and to provide intelligence information and maintain escape networks, which helped Allied troops during the Second World War. It's kind of interesting that the chairman of the French Senate's Franco-British Friendship Committee said it was a way of holding out a hand to Britain after Brexit. Ironically, it seems to sort of have laid bare the sort of very worst of our relationships with France, in that everybody that doesn't want that has become incredibly vocal about it.
But then, Arion, there's this kind of, and I'm turning to you, but of course you're a foreigner on our soil as well, but perhaps that puts this into clarity for you. There's kind of a joke, isn't there, between French and British people, that we're opposites and, we detest certain parts of each other's culture and character. Whereas actually, in fact, the two countries are geographically very close to each other and share a lot in common, and that's the unsaid bit of that rivalry.
Yeah, like Australia's rivalry with Britain has a whole lot of friendliness underpinning it. Of course, France actually did go to war with these Fair Isles, so there is that difference of history. But yeah, I think those critiques within Le Figaro, which have been requoted all around the press as if they speak for the French attitude to London and this award being granted to it, are probably fairly minor, and actually the two countries do share a lot of kinship, and particularly now, and particularly as Felicity was implying going forward and past Brexit, that, you know, there's reasons for the two countries to be trying to embrace one another.
Do you think that might work, Felicity?
Yeah, as we're saying, I think it is these sort of corners of the internet and the right-wing tabloids that will stir outrage up about these sort of stories. I think my first reaction to the story was, it's 80 years. Like, come on, this was such a long time ago. Why are you giving an award to London now? You know, it's a bit late. But it's not really. I think with Brexit and these kind of fears of, like, you know, the continent fracturing, I think it is really, really pertinent. And I think it's really interesting that kind of history's its legacy still impacting us and affecting us today. I'm reading this really great book at the moment called East West Street by Philippe Sands, which I'd highly recommend. The book is sort of about the Nuremberg trials and two founding fathers of human rights who were instrumental in the Nuremberg trials, and also his grandfather Légion, who was Jewish and had to flee Europe and come to this country. And there is just so much history in there that I'd sort of forgotten. Like, it talks about the Anschluss, and it talks about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union. And it also talks about the suffering in the Second World War. And I think why it packs such a punch is that Sands is a lawyer by trade, and he's very kind of dispassionate. So the way he talks about the suffering on the continent is even more horrific because he's trying to avoid that kind of sensationalism. And I do feel like, you know, with the anti-Semitic issues in the Labour Party and anti-immigrant rhetoric more generally, I think there is a real fear that we forget actually what happened in the Second World War, like that detail and the horror of it.
Which, of course, led to the EU. I mean, we don't want to turn this into a Brexit discussion, but it is legitimate to point that out, isn't it? We're leaving the organisation,
100%.
which was one of the things that helped keep Europe together after the Second World War. The other thing that amuses me about this story, Joe, is the fact that here in Britain, there's a controversy every year. You can predict it sure as clockwork. January the 1st, the headlines will be, your train fare's going up, so that's disappointing, and look at all of these people that have got honours that don't deserve them. And, you know, there's a controversy over our New Year's honours list. It appears that in France they have the same issue. And I wonder whether that means that some people will say this system of nations honouring individuals and other nations is itself old-fashioned and its time has come.
It's been pointed out by some French officials that this honour has also been bestowed on lots of other places. Very uncontroversially, it was bestowed on cities in the Republic of Congo, in Algiers, in Belgrade, Luxembourg, Russia, all for their contributions during the First and Second World Wars. So it was fairly uncontroversial when it was awarded to all of those places.
And simultaneously, it's been granted to individuals that have been, or gone on to be, very controversial, like Vladimir Putin, Bashar al-Assad, Mussolini was given the Legion of Honor. So there's reason for the French to be maybe raising an eyebrow at this.
So should it
at the
be the
award in
end of
general.
this kind of honour? Or, actually, is it quite a nice thing? And I often think when I read those stories where there's a backlash, where they say, oh, this person shouldn't have been awarded another honour because they did something wrong 20 years ago or whatever. I just kind of think, it's a nice thing, isn't it? Imagine that letter coming through the post. It's a nice thing that someone official is saying the country officially recognises your contribution.
I think it's a nice thing, and it can also be a valuable thing, as Felicity was saying. If this is the thing that prompts loads of people in both London and Paris to revisit Second World War history and think about it anew, then that in itself is valuable. Simultaneously, it's useful for Macron, and I think that this shouldn't be underestimated, in his attempts to build bridges with Boris Johnson, who obviously has a relationship with London itself, having been mayor of the city. And in the early days after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, Macron was actually quite sniffy about him and implied that he was a liar, and has subsequently been trying to amend that view and make a sort of comeback. So you can see why Macron himself is trying to do this at this time.
All right, Joe, you're up next after this. Next up this week, it's Joe. Joe, what is your story of the week?
When is the right time to have the right to die?
This is my last Paralympic Games. I have a progressive disease, and I signed my euthanasia papers already in 2008 because it's really, really hard to handle and to suffer with this disease. But the euthanasia, it gives me a feeling of rest. It gives me, I can live with a good feeling. Whatever what happened, I have my papers in my hand, but I'm still enjoying every little moment.
Marieke Vervoet, the Belgian Paralympic silver medalist, speaking at a news conference in 2016. Joe, why have you played us that clip?
So Belgium and the Netherlands, which are already two of the most liberal countries in the world when it comes to euthanasia law, are considering taking steps to allow dementia patients to end their own lives.
So Vervoet, that we were just hearing from, she did end her own life, but that was as a result of a terminal illness.
That was a result of an illness
pain,
which would currently be covered under their euthanasia legislation, because currently it's only permitted for people that have all their faculties and people that suffer from irreversible conditions or are in an irreversible coma. But this extension of the legislation would allow people that are either deteriorating through dementia or fear they may at some point suffer dementia to have it written into their will that they have a right to choose to end their life.
And you can sort of see the sense of that if you have it legal that someone with an irreversible condition can say, I want to die. Dementia is an irreversible condition. I mean, it can be treated, but it can't be cured. It makes sense, doesn't it?
So to a degree, yes, it does make sense. And, it's striking that the kind of areas this has support in are places like Flanders, which are predominantly Catholic areas, but the sort of humanitarian argument seems to have won through in this particular instance. It is ever so slightly controversial, though. In 2018, two terminally ill children, aged 9 and 11, were given lethal injections in Belgium and became the world's youngest people to be euthanized. And then adding controversy to that, in 2018, there was a dementia patient euthanized who had never actually requested to die, but had the decision made by her family, which also kind of led to outcry and led the NVA, which is Belgium's largest party, and the centre-right party in Belgium to oppose any extension to the law until the law as it stands has been fully evaluated.
It's that clarification, isn't it, that's always really difficult, Felicity. I mean, you can't allow for every possible permutation of a family scenario when you're drafting that sort of law.
But I think the tricky thing with dementia is that it's that issue of consent, isn't it? And whilst you've still got all your faculties and you can say, if I can no longer recognise my family members, if I can no longer do this or that, I want to be euthanized, and that's fine. But then as your condition deteriorates, you can no longer provide that consent. And I think that's really scary, because I mean that's the whole point. If someone then sort of denies that they ever said that throws the doctor and the family into a really, really difficult position. It is sort of trickiest for doctors who swear by the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm and all that sort of thing. It's extremely difficult and puts them in a really, really horrible position. I think what I found more disturbing about this is that I hadn't realised that euthanasia in some countries is legal for people suffering psychiatric illness, so anxiety and depression and personality disorders and that sort of thing. There was a case of a 29-year-old, a Dutch woman called Aurelia Brouwers. She wasn't terminally ill, and she was allowed to end her life on account of her psychiatric illness. She said, I've chosen this because I have a lot of mental health issues. I suffer unbearably and hopelessly. Every breath I take is torture. And I think, again, going back to the doctor, if you already knew that someone had a terminal illness or was so far along that whatever you did, it wasn't going to reduce their life by that much. That is very different from a 29-year-old.
Yeah.
You had no idea what her life could have turned out to be. To have a part in taking away her life, I find that extremely difficult.
But then I suppose as well, Arion, if the realistic alternative scenario is that person is going to take their own life in a much more grisly way, in that sense, you're helping them have a better end, aren't you?
I guess that's true. Or you're also preventing people from having to travel to other countries or other states where euthanasia is legal and bypass the legal system or the legal structure within which they currently live. But, there are a range of concerns, not only around the desires of a patient, particularly once that patient becomes less mentally able themselves. But you have the obvious religious objections that come up when this argument is discussed.
Which are what? Basically, God gives life, God should take it away.
Exactly.
But then you said, Joe, that in Catholic areas they're supporting this. Talk me through that.
So it's quite striking, yes, that an area such as Flanders is so in favour of it. Recent polling suggests that around 8 out of 10 residents in Flanders, which is a predominantly Catholic area, are in support of the move.
So why? Are they putting their religion to one side, or have they found an answer within it?
I mean, the New Yorker's done a fairly long report on this, which is excellent. I'd recommend reading it if people are kind of interested in finding out more. The dominant language in Flanders is Dutch, which some people have suggested has sort of influenced the perception of euthanasia in that particular area, because the Dutch have got such a sort of liberal attitude to this, and Dutch magazines are very popular, Dutch newspapers are very popular there. It's a very strange one. It's very unusual because the Catholic Church is obviously so opposed to the idea. But in Flanders, euthanasia accounts for nearly 5% of all deaths. So it's widely used and fairly sort of understood.
And also for all states that have introduced euthanasia laws to allow people to take their own lives or be assisted in taking their own lives, there's been a really steady increase in the number of people doing so. And it looks as though the initial moral, ethical or religious objections that people hold prior to the legalization of people being able to take their own lives seem to fade away. And I think that's one of the things that, as Joe mentioned at the beginning of this segment, is one of the things that that conservatives within both of those countries want to consider. We're still so early in terms of how long this has been going on that there is this feeling that people want to pause and reflect on the trajectory of this sharp increase in people taking their own lives before they relax the laws any further.
I mean, the truth is that people don't really know what to think, do they? And this is one of those stories, having dismissed the role of commenters on news websites in our previous story, I did have a look on the Daily Mail online to see what people were saying about this story, because I thought it would be quite interesting. And, unlike with, for example, an abortion story where you'd absolutely expect a polarisation of views on Mail Online and some pretty firm views, actually, people were pretty much responding to their own experience, saying, my mother had this, my father had dementia, I work in palliative care, I don't know what I think about this. And that's the problem. There's like a paralysis of what to do.
And that's right. Around the world, the argument is being won by those in favour of euthanasia. Massive increases in support for it being legalised in most places, including the UK, where it's still not legal. A Times study in 2007 found that 80% of people said that they wanted the law change to give terminally ill patients the right to die with a doctor's help. And it's much lower for people who don't have a terminal illness, but it's still fairly significant.
I suppose the issue is we'd all want the right for ourselves, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I think it is the idea of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And if you've seen someone who suffered from dementia or seen someone who suffered from a dreadful terminal illness, and if you can very readily put yourself there and think, yes, I would want the right to die in a civilised way in a time of my choosing. And I think that is probably sort of a Christian moral thing. And it's also supported by human rights law and, the right to not be in intolerable pain or suffer degrading treatment or anything like that. And I think it is going back to the idea that, some people would just commit suicide anyway. I think the idea of being able to choreograph your death with the people you love around you and to be able to create in some ways a really nice exit from this world rather than, waiting until the kids are at school and hanging yourself in the garage. Like that, I think that's something that more and more people are embracing.
I think the point you raised about putting yourself in other people's shoes is a really complicated one. Like I watched my grandmother sort of deteriorate with dementia over sort of 5-6 years, and I was fairly young at the time, and putting yourself in their shoes is incredibly difficult because while on the one hand we were watching her sort of deteriorate and forget who we were, on the other hand we have some hilarious stories and she would break out into hysterical laughter at the weirdest things and did die with dignity, died with her family around her in a very nice nursing home and sort of, I would like to think, had a kind of good final few years.
That's the thing you can't know, can you, when you make the decision when you're lucid, so-called, whether you're actually going to be having a good time. I know that's a really facile thing to say, but obviously your physical life may be crumbling and your brain may be deteriorating, but things still make you laugh, things still make you happy.
Of course, and I'm terrified of the idea of potentially losing my critical faculties when I'm older, but at the same time, having watched the quality of life that my grandmother still had in those final years, I can understand the argument for the fact that it is maybe not the right decision to decide when you're still lucid because, as you say, you have no idea what your quality of life will actually be in those circumstances.
And also, when people make that decision, are they really making it for themselves or are they making it for their children, their relatives, the people they leave behind? A friend of mine, his father has dementia at the moment, and he said to me recently that he went to the GP with him, and the GP said, I have some really bad news, which is there's nothing wrong with him. As in, his physical strength is fine. This is going to go on for another 10 or 20 years probably, but his brain is deteriorating to the point where he's no longer recognising him anymore. That's really hard for my friend. It's probably not that hard for his father.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, and I wonder whether if there's going to be that pressure on people who, and it's not just dementia, a range of illnesses that you want to carry on living, but do you feel that you're a burden on your family, and that there's that pressure that you should actually be considering taking your life, which is like unbearably grim to think about.
Nonetheless, Jo, you have chosen this as your story of the week as we start this new year. Why? Why do you think this is significant? Because Belgium and the Netherlands, they already have laws about euthanasia. Okay, they may be tweaking this. Do you think this is going to roll out around the rest of Europe eventually?
I think that Arion is right to make the point earlier that the polling on kind of people's opinions on euthanasia is all evidence is a shift in the direction of support for the move and for legislation that advocates for people's right to die and end their life in the sort of dignified and orderly fashion that they decide to do so. And I think that's why I chose it as the story of the week, because while it's currently kind of legal in Belgium and Canada and Colombia and all these places that forebearers of liberal law in sort of the Western world, I think it's sort of inevitable that this will sort of touch closer to home at some point.
Okay. Arion, you are up next after this. Finally this week, it is Arion. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week we discovered that in New Zealand, the lady's not for turning.
All right, you turn-a-dern dickheads. I found one that you've done, so I'm turning it back round. Just to thwart you, you bunch of bloody muppets. Stop being so stupid and infantile.
A Twitter video there from the user @melulator. Rather amusing Twitter handle. Arion, what was she doing there?
Melulator was turning over magazines that had already been turned over in a newsagent to obscure the face of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. And there's this peaceful protest ongoing in the country that hashtags itself Turn Ardern, with people who say that they are sick of the Prime Minister's overexposure and they think that she should be getting back to work and fixing the country rather than appearing in photo shoots and on the covers of magazines.
Is she appearing in a lot of photo shoots and on the covers of magazines?
She is, but one wonders if it's not just the case with any national leader, that they're always going to appear on lots of magazines. I think Ardern has actually got a very broad exposure and support, not just in New Zealand, but around the world, not least of all because she's a really young leader. She's only 39 and she was 37 when she came to power, but also because she's enormously socially progressive and she's had some international hits or moments where she's shown great leadership, not least of all in the wake of the Christchurch massacre on mosques last year. And she just really had this moment of expressing the kind of support for the victims that I think a lot of people wish that their leaders were able to do, and that really shone a spotlight on her internationally.
While still embodying all of her values, let's not name the killer and all this sort of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
So this thing about Turn Ardern, I haven't searched for it on Twitter myself. Is it a thing? Is it a thing? Lots of people are going into newsagents in New Zealand, filming themselves, turning magazines over so that her face is obscured.
Yes, and they say that campaign is aimed to prevent the magazines from profiting from putting her on the cover, thus disincentivizing them from featuring her on future magazines, and then, she'll get back to work. That's the idea. And there's a counter movement, it should be said, of people using the hashtag Return Ardern, who are turning the magazines back over again.
So
like
return Ardern,
yeah,
but also return Ardern electorally.
Well, that's what people are saying could be Labour's slogan going into this election year, that Return Ardern could come to be the thing that they run under.
Okay, and just briefly before I open this up to everyone else, so what? It is interesting, but what's the significance of this? It seems like just a sort of viral, meme-y, weird thing.
Interesting because of the relationship of this young female leader with this kind of campaign. Interesting as well because actually her popularity has been plummeting in New Zealand, and her popularity even in the last couple of months has moved from about 51% to about 40%. So she herself has had a number of domestic missteps that have seen her become less approved of. But yeah, it's sort of a broad question of whether that's what's driving this or if it's something else.
What do you think's driving it, Felicity?
Sexism. I think this is just simple, basic sexism, really. I think it's a male thing. It's blokes who are turning over her picture, and I think it's just men being threatened by a powerful woman who's appearing on magazines who can't really deal with it. I think,
and those same people you think genuinely, if it was a male prime minister who was appearing on the front cover of magazines, wouldn't be saying he needs to stop doing photo shoots.
100%. This is totally the fact that she is young and female, and she's appearing on glossy magazines, and guys are going around and turning it over, and it is infantile and it is pathetic. I think it's interesting because it gets you into conversation about personality and style versus, policies, which we're seeing in other countries too. Like, is it enough just to be charismatic? Is it important how you look and all that sort of thing? And obviously there are double standards when it comes to women, and we've seen that with Theresa May, and we've seen all sorts of female leaders, how much they get critiqued over what they look like and the tone of their voice and absolutely everything. I think it's about that, but I do think it's interesting in that if you actually want to dig into her record, people, when you talk about, oh, she's a brilliant leader, and you ask, like, oh, why is she good? They will take you to the terror attack and say, oh, it's because she was so brilliant and she wore the hijab and she said, sort of unifying sentiments that people like. But actually, in terms of domestic politics and what she's done, that's a genuine argument.
Well, so where it may not be pure misogyny is, because people said this about Obama, didn't they, in America, and people said this about Blair here in the UK, when you have a leader who's clearly an excellent communicator and around the world people respond to them as an orator, that maybe is a problem domestically because they start focusing on their international profile, and it's about how they look when they're saying something rather than necessarily what they're doing locally.
So I think this is not only, I agree, blatant sexism, frankly. When you look at the sort of US and you look at someone like Beto O'Rourke, who managed to get a Vanity Fair cover despite losing in Texas and dropping out of the Democratic candidacy race fairly early on, there was no outcry about him featuring on a national magazine. What's the difference? It's fairly blatantly obvious what the difference is between those two examples. But to be fair, this isn't one magazine. This is a plethora of magazines. People saying she's on 5 or 6 a week, right? Well, O'Rourke was also profiling The New Yorker. He was profiling Vanity Fair. There was widespread coverage of a male white politician who had won nothing. I also think this feeds perfectly well into the sort of culture war that's taking place across democracies everywhere, in that it sort of suits a narrative for this to be seen as a peaceful protest about the way she carries out her politics. But it seems to me that when you just scroll through Twitter, a lot of it is actually clearly people that dislike her liberal politics, and that it's less a protest against the way that she sort of presents herself and the way that she carries herself on magazine covers, and it's actually just a protest against the fact that she's an incredibly socially liberal, progressive politician. Do you think it's working on its own terms, though, Arion? I mean, it seems to me like creating a viral hashtag to take attention away from somebody is a bit of a contradiction.
Yes and no. I think that the guy who began this campaign, a 66-year-old bricklayer called Colin Wilson, would certainly regard himself as having got his message out.
He just got a name check.
But there's also a book out, a biography of Jacinda Ardern called The Story Behind an Extraordinary Leader. And this campaign alone has been attributed with having boosted the sales of that book. I'm sure also the Return Ardern campaign has been a boon not only for her potential political campaign this year, but also for people who broadly agree with her having the opportunity to say, I broadly agree with her. So I don't think it's totally been a successful campaign.
I mean, Felicity, would you ever now consider thinking twice about putting Jacinda Ardern on the front of The Week Junior? I know that tends to be not the kind of thing you feature on the front of The Week Junior anyway, but would it play into your thinking? Do you think it's legitimate for journalists to consider this?
I mean, I don't see why we wouldn't have her on the front cover. I mean, on the magazine, we're always looking for positive role models, and it might be quite simplistic, but I think, why not?
But that's the editorial reason. Well, the answer to why not is because your salespeople might say, well, hold on, people are turning the magazine around, we're going to sell fewer copies. That's why. That's the pressure, isn't it?
They wouldn't. I just wouldn't happen in this country. I just can't say.
Well, actually, on the this country business, I hope this doesn't sound terribly xenophobic towards Australians, but listeners, I am putting this to an Australian. This kind of sort of latent misogyny feels like something that feels a bit more Australian than Kiwi, actually. I do think of New Zealand as having more progressive values. It's quite interesting that if this is just about sexism, this is a New Zealand thing, not an Aussie thing.
Yes, I think that could definitely be the case. I do think that over the recent years, New Zealand has been more progressive politically, but don't forget that Ardern replaced, 10 years of conservative rule in New Zealand. And so, this is a country that has, I'd say that its misogyny is not remarkable. I'd say it's fairly standard.
The author and academic Max Rushbrook, who's also based in New Zealand and teaches in New Zealand, also made this, that she is a fundamental challenge to what he described as the sort of macho slant of New Zealand politics. as Arion points out, she replaced Sir Bill English, a socially conservative, anti-same-sex union, anti-abortion, anti-medicinal cannabis, anti-progressive politician. And I think that actually comes to the crux of this, that what she is really is a challenge to the status quo of New Zealand's politics, and that there's a certain type of predominantly bloke on social media that really doesn't like that.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Joe Evans, Felicity Capon and Arion McNicoll. And just by the way, I'm aware of a magazine you should never turn around on the shelves because it always has a delightful topical cartoon on the front. And that, of course, is The Week. It is available wherever you buy your magazines or online at theweek.co.uk. We are online as well, of course. We're a podcast. We're on Twitter at Week Unwrapped, and you can hit subscribe to get us every week by searching for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week,